The World Trade Organization has announced a compromise deal for intellectual property rights on vaccines against COVID-19. The WTO says the waiver agreement is between four major manufacturing players. It says the decisive progress made involves the European Union, the United States, India and South Africa. The WTO has further called on other member countries to join the fray.
WTO Chief Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala says details of the compromise are not yet all worked out. But she emphasizes that this is a big step forward. In the United States, the Chamber of Commerce has already expressed its opposition to a waiver of intellectual property rights. France says the next step is for the technical agreement to be confirmed at the political level. The WTO says the compromise on the table will only be applicable to developing countries. This will apply only to the countries accounting for less than 10% of annual world exports of vaccines against COVID-19. The compromise does not aim to dismantle the current intellectual property system, but to facilitate the granting of compulsory licenses in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic and future health crises. Under the WTO agreements, a compulsory license makes it possible for public authorities to use a patent without the authorization of its holder. Once the compromise has been validated politically, the EU, the United States, India and South Africa will have to convince the other members of the WTO, where decisions are taken by consensus. Switzerland, which is home to major pharmaceutical companies, has repeatedly expressed its strong reservations about the principle of a waiver of intellectual property rights.
To speak more about this, Candice Sehoma is Access Campaign Advocacy Advisor from Doctors Without Borders. She speaks to us via Zoom. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps let's just give a bit of background of what South Africa and India were asking for.
So thank you so much for having me. So South Africa and India made a proposition in October 2020, which was a proposal to the World Trade Organizations to have a waiver on all COVID-19 medical tools. This was as a result of, the global inequities when it comes to access to these medical tools. As you might remember, during, at early stages of the pandemic, there were, global demands, which, we with the supply that we have in globally, it couldn't meet the global demands. So with this waiver and this proposition was to ensure that countries, particularly countries in low and middle income settings, could have, sort of legal policies and context to be able to manufacture, to be able to respond to the pandemic with the global supply.
And just for context, South Africa, India as the developing countries who are approaching the EU bloc and the US in this. And we understand the WTO Director General saying that there are considerable restrictions, but once these four major players agree, then there would be a need to convince other players of the decision. So this step in the right direction, what is it exactly?
So I think you put it out nicely, that there has been some interesting developments in terms of the waiver in itself and in the discussions around the waiver. 18 months later, we are finally having a step where these countries, the EU, US, South Africa, and India, are able to sort of have some kind of an agreement. However, the text that has been leaked yesterday on what has been agreed by these four countries is also sort of far from being what South Africa and India initially called for. According to our analysis, there are key limitations, to what has been proposed. Firstly, that it only covers vaccines. So as initial proposition was to cover all COVID-19 medical tools. The new text covers only vaccines and also quite limited in terms of its geographical scope, and only covers patents and doesn't address other intellectual property barriers, such as trade secrets, which may have, cover in critical information needed to facilitate manufacturing. So I think with the new text, it has very broad limitations, which we believe that it is a step in the right direction, that they are coming to some kind of discussion and some kind of agreement. However, what has been agreed on at the moment is not enough. I think there should be a revision in terms of the text and what it's able to do, because at the moment it is quite limited.
And this is what I want to understand, just that limited access, I believe, is representing less than 10% of the annual world exports, as you mentioned, of vaccines, excluding de facto China. What exactly does that mean?
So one of the restrictions is that this particular text only applies to, or this particular sort of provision will only apply to countries who have exported less than 10% of their COVID-19 medical tools, or vaccines rather. Although countries like Brazil, for example, they do have manufacturing capacity, China has manufacturing capacity. However, this will exclude them from being able to be included in this waiver. And that's unfortunate, considering their manufacturing or their capacity in the country, but also countries like Brazil, who have those manufacturing capacity, and however they were excluded from being called a developing country. So in essence, this will exclude them from being included into this provision. So it does exclude critical countries who do have manufacturing capacity from even being part of this agreement. So that's why we say that it's very important that the geographical scope isn't as limited and isn't as stringent as it is currently.
And as you said that the technology transfer goes far beyond patents, I want to look at what the WTO agreements says in terms of compulsory licensing and compensation to the group at its origin.
Sorry, please just repeat that again.
So the WTO, what are its agreements in terms of compulsory licensing as it exists, and especially with regards to compensation to the group at its origin? It has said, as you mentioned, that the technology transfer goes far beyond the patents.
Yeah, so with the current mechanisms in place, I think one thing we need to consider is that with the current flexibilities that we have in place are not applicable in a context of a pandemic. They might be applicable in the context of national emergencies, but in a global pandemic, different mechanisms need to be applied. And in the case of a compulsory license, what it does is that governments can have the authority to grant intellectual property or patents to local manufacturer to be able to produce these vaccines or COVID-19 medical tools without the permission of the patent holder. That's the current mechanism that is in place. However, if we to look into the South African context, in order for us to be able to grant that compulsory license, it's not an easy process. It will require a lot of money to be able to do that. It would take about 3 years because it's something that has to go through the courts. So there isn't an administrative process to be able to offer that or to grant that compulsory license. So it's a very stringent process. And with the waiver, and hence we were calling for a waiver because we would have more of an automatic process and have far less requirements than what the current compulsory license mechanism has in place. And what we're saying is that with this current text, it has very limited benefit, and also looking at the requirements, it has very cumbersome requirements and very cumbersome reporting process where they would require the country to issue like a long list of details and patents, and we believe that this requirement sort of undermines the need to have a fast-tracked process to enable local manufacturing. So, and hence we're saying that this current proposal, this current text, which is essentially actually a compulsory license proposal. It's not a waiver. We're saying that it's not useful for the current context because of its requirements, for its cumbersome requirements, which doesn't make it easy for governments to be able to use.
So as the negotiations over the text continue at a political level, as NGOs, what are you saying to the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Association, for instance, because they've been against this? You're calling for a sharing of knowledge. What are they fundamentally against? I know there's been a lot of talk about Big Pharma and how it's capitalizing on this horrific global occurrence. What are you saying in negotiations that, you can still keep making your money, but let's save lives? How does the text relate to these negotiations?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a long-standing problem that we've had, in the height of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, with TB medicine, with cancer medicine, and now with COVID. And, and unfortunately, the systemic barriers protect pharmaceuticals be able to, make profit out of people's lives. And what we've saying, I mean, it's also something that we also can't rely on pharmaceutical generosity, and hence we need structural changes. And that's why we need our governments to do something, to change our systems, to be able to enforce that and not have to beg pharmaceuticals to sort of, work with us. It's something that part of the work that we do is to call on pharmaceuticals to share their technologies with capable manufacturers in South Africa. As you would know, even, there is this new established mRNA hub to enable South Africa to be able to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. However, even with going to Moderna, to Pfizer, to us, asking them to share their technology with this mRNA hub to enable them to manufacture this vaccine, they have not been forthcoming. And it's something that we need, mechanisms. We need to sort of take the whole thing on our hands, and part of the process, and this is where intellectual property and changing and even reforming our intellectual property laws in South Africa is very important, because as it stands, our current law isn't very favorable to the generic market. It's very favorable to big multinational pharmaceuticals. So we need to change our systems to enable generic marketing, to enable competition and do away with this monopolistic way of how pharmaceuticals do their business.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights with us. Much, much appreciated. Candice Sehoma, Access Campaign Advocacy Advisor from Doctors Without Borders, speaking to us about that feat. The WTO praising South Africa and India on the progress that's been made on negotiating this intellectual property rights with regards to the manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines.